Hello there. Welcome to the Welcome Matt channel. I'm your host Matt, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different. I wanted to start a series of videos where I'm going to be talking about each of the traits in the figures in Star Wars Imperial Assault, which is a miniatures game from Fantasy Flight Games, as Stefan with Board Wars often likes to say. And I'm going to basically talk about the command cards for each trait and just go through all of the traits. I'll do one short video for each trait. My goal for the series is for it to be digestible in small chunks and something that you can listen to while you're, driving, doing chores, whatever. And hopefully this can be something for if you're a new player. It kind of gives you an idea of what command cards are really good if you're wanting to get into the competitive Imperial Assault tournament scene without having to go through the grinding of just trying out cards to see if they're actually useful. So without further ado, let's get diving into it. Today we're going to start off by talking about the spy trait. Now, if you're not familiar with what a trait is, if you look at the top right of deployment cards in Imperial Assault, there's usually a keyword there that'll say something like spy. Some groups may have more than one trait. An example being Agent Blaze here. He is both a spy and a leader, so he's got two traits. And the reason this is really important for the skirmish mode is there are many command cards in Imperial Assault that are only available to a certain trait. So for example, if you look in the middle of the card, cards that are limited to a particular figure type will say something like spy, or some cards may say something like smuggler or spy. So if you're either one of those traits, you can play that card. While there's many command cards that are usable by different types of figures, some even all figures. So for example, Element of Surprise is any figure. A card like size advantage would be available for a figure like Captain Taro or a Dewback Rider. That's a 2x1 figure space. Jabba the Hutt, ATDP could all play a size advantage, while a figure that just occupies one space, like Darth Vader or Luke Skywalker, couldn't play size advantage. So, if you're not familiar with how traits work, hopefully that explains it to you. So we're going to talk about the spies here, and we're just going to go using the Tabletop Admiral website, which is a fantastic site where you can build lists and search through the command cards, and it's really helpful for me. I highly recommend it for using it when you have a computer. You can have your own profile, and you can log in and save your own lists. You can look through on the website other lists that people have posted and just get ideas and think through what you want to play with. So without further ado, let's dive into the spy command cards. The first one we have today is called Hide in Plain Sight, with the picture of Leia Organa when she was in her Bouche costume from Return of the Jedi, when she went to go rescue Han and at Jabba's palace there. This is a 3-cost card that you can only have one of in your deck, and it's for spies, and it says, as one special action until the end of the round, you cannot be the target of an attack. This card has been around since the Rebel Saboteurs pack came out, which was a Wave 1 set of 2 figures that came out. So this card, it's strong. Not being attacked during the round is very powerful. It's not as strong as it used to be because in this game there are so many figures that now have access to either abilities on their own card or through command cards that can attack either at the end of the round or at the start of a round. And you'll notice that Hide in Plain Sight says only until the end of the round you cannot be attacked. So for example, figures like Darth Vader and Han Solo, which have free attacks at the end of the round, Hide in Plain Sight doesn't stop that. It also doesn't stop command cards like Ferocity, which lets a creature do an attack at the end of a round, or Genlin Terror, which lets a Bantha Rider or a Tusken Raider attack at the end of a round. Call the Vanguard, which lets troopers attack at the beginning of a round. It's not a card you see very much, but Set a Trap allows a figure to attack another figure on the same tile at the end of a round. All of those cards are immune to Hide in Plain Sight. So where could Hide in Plain Sight fit in the meta? I think probably one of the best figures for Hide in Plain Sight would probably be Ahsoka Tano, who is a rebel Jedi. She is really great with her mobility of being able to get in and out of places and perform an attack. But what's difficult about Ahsoka is she's kind of a deep striker. Like once you throw her in the fray, even though she's 12 health, you'll find that she melts pretty fast. She'll often be able to get two-shotted by an opponent, assuming you don't roll a dodge and your dodge isn't taken away by a command card or an ability or something. She can gain that +1 block token, which can help her a little bit, but there's so much Pierce going around in the meta right now. It's oftentimes that, I mean, it depends on who you're facing, but that's not, the block isn't guaranteed to be useful, I think is what I'm trying to say. So for Ahsoka to have a card like Hide in Plain Sight allows her to potentially start her activation. She can move 2 free movement points, run up and strike someone, and then play Hide in Plain Sight. And so she can just sit there and chill until the end of the round. And this mitigates one of the key components of Imperial Assault, which is that sometimes you have to expose your figures to attack your opponent's figures. When you try, and you're trying to do this and figure out if the risk of putting your figure out there is worth it for you to defeat one of their figures, if there's a higher upswing and higher value for you. Hide in Plain Sight mitigates that because you can run in, get your attack, and still be safe. So it also costs 3 though, which is a fifth of your command points in the deck. And at this point in the game, there are so many command cards that are so valuable. It's hard to justify Hide in Plain Sight because it costs an action. If it didn't cost an action, I think it would probably go in every spy deck. It's pretty strong. It's a niche card, but it definitely can be useful in the right deck and with the right play style. You have to have the right kind of list that would really accommodate this type of card. So a good card, but not a meta-defining card by any means. Next we have Slippery Target, which is Smuggler or Spy. Used when a hostile figure enters an adjacent space. Gain movement points equal to your speed. So this card is very useful for countering melee figures. For a long time in the meta, melee figures were kind of irrelevant. They have come back though. Darth Vader, Riot Troopers. With Spectre Cell, we're seeing Jedi make a rise and a comeback. So Slippery Target has more value now than it did before, for sure. The fact that it can be played by smugglers or spies gives it a lot of synergy if you're running a mercenary or a rebel list. It's even useful with a figure like Chewbacca, who could slam another figure and move them to an adjacent space, and then trigger Slippery Target and move himself out of harm's way, or maybe move himself to set up an attack that your opponent wasn't expecting. Maybe you were out of line of sight before. There's all kinds of cool things you can do with that. And you'll notice you're gaining the movement points, so it's not like it's costing you an action to spend them. So it's really great with something like Chewbacca because you could theoretically slam for free, move again, and then get off a shot or something like that. Slippery Target, the reason you don't always see it is because, like we said before, it's really good against melee. Like, a melee figure walks up to you, and as soon as they walk up to you, you can play this card and run away. The only fear being if it's a figure that's a brawler, they can play Parting Blow. But we'll get to that when we get to the brawler cards. So the other problem, though, is if you're facing a list with a lot of ranged figures, you're not guaranteed for them to enter a space adjacent to you. There are some missions in the past where you would have to stand on like a crate or something, and you would get a certain amount of victory points at the end of the round. And so a card like Slippery Target would be pretty strong there because a figure is likely to at some point come up to contest. And so if you needed to keep your figure safe, you could Slippery Target to move them away. There's more optimal cards though, and one of the main things that competitive players are looking for is consistency. Slippery Target, if melee units were the meta, Slippery Target would be a very strong card. But they're not. You're not necessarily going to go up against a melee list. So, is it playable? Yes. Is it an auto-include type thing? No. I forgot to mention that this card costs 2, and you can have 2 copies of it in your deck. So, interesting there. It came with the Han Solo pack. So that's Slippery Target. Next we'll go on to Comm Disruption, which came from the ISB Infiltrators pack. It's a 2-cost card that you can have 1 copy of in your deck. Use when a command card with a cost of X is played, where X is equal to or less than the number of friendly spy groups on the map. Discard that card and cancel its effects. So basically, Comm Disrupt is like negation on steroids. It's able to cancel a card's value based on the number of spies you have. So if you had, and then notice it says group, it doesn't say figures. So if you have the ISB Infiltrators, it would still only cancel a card that costs 1. It wouldn't cancel a card that costs 2. So very strong at being able to cancel command cards that your opponents have played. If you're running 3 sets of spies, you can cancel any command card in the entire game, which is very strong. It can overcome negation. So if you've played Take Initiative and your opponent plays negation, you can play Comm Disrupt if you have 1 spy and stop it. You could even use Comm Disrupt to stop 0-cost cards. And you'll notice that it says equal to the number of spy groups on the map. So you don't have to be a spy to play this command card. Any figure can play this. You're just going to get more value if you have spies. You could run this in a list without spies as just basically a second copy of negation that costs 2 in your command deck and stop any 0-cost card that you wanted to. So the nice thing about Comm Disrupt is you're typically going to get at least some kind of value out of it. Even if your spies die before you can get it off to stop the more the really powerful 3 2-cost cards. Comm Disrupt is a solid choice. I ran in a regionals list last year with 1 spy, and I found in like half of my games that Comm Disrupt would be able to stop a really powerful command card. So, moving on to Intelligence Leak. This is a 1-cost card. You can have 1 of in your deck. Came in the Agent Blaze pack. Used during activation to look at your opponent's hand. You may choose and discard a command card from it. Then you suffer strain equal to that card's cost. Intelligence Leak is probably the most auto-include spy card in the game. It's very powerful. Hand knowledge in the hands of a right player is one of the most important things in a game like Imperial Assault. Knowing what your opponent has up their sleeve. You can discard any of their command cards by just taking strain. And so you can choose to either get rid of cards from your own deck to do that, or you can take it as damage. Many times you will want to take it as damage, so a lot of the figures that you want to play this kind of spy card would be low-cost figures that won't be defeated. So for example, Mac is a great choice because with 4 health, Mac is very easily one-shot by a number of figures in this game. But he can get rid of any card that costs 3 and still have like 1 health left. There's some figures that even have Recover that have the spy trait. So for example, Leia Organa is a spy who has a surge for Recover 2, I believe. Let's see if I can find Leia here. Where did Leia go? Am I blind? Oh, here she is. Yeah, so for example, Leia is a great option because she can take the damage and then recover it right back. A great example in the mercenary faction would be the Claudite Shapeshifter. The Senator form of that can also surge to recover damage. So good choice there. Sometimes you may need to do the cards off the top of your deck, but anyways, Intelligence Leak is just a really powerful card. It's if you're running spies, you want to run this card. It's still very powerful in the game. Being able to get rid of, you're basically trading your card for one of theirs, and trading an Intelligence Leak for a Blaze of Glory or a Son of Skywalker or an Assassinate or an On the Lam. Or even with Spectre Cell cards like Pummel or Strength in Numbers is very, very strong. So, Intelligence Leak. If you're running spies, you should run it. The next card we have is Data Theft. It's from the ISB Infiltrators pack. It says, for a special action, choose a command card in your opponent's discard pile. Once during this round, you may play that card as though it was in your hand. So, this is a really fun card. It's probably too inconsistent to be in most... Like, I've never really seen it in a top-tier competitive list. The upside of it is very strong. Being able to take one of your opponent's command cards that you can play, like an Assassinate or something, is bonkers crazy good. The problem is, similar to... what I said before, like in the like with Slippery Target, you don't really know what matchup you're going to be facing. So you may be facing an opponent who has character traits in their list that are very different from yours. So a number of their command cards would prove, basically useless to you. Now most lists are going to have at least a few command cards that any figure can play. So there can be use for Data Theft, but it may not be a card that you really need. So it's basically trading a card into action for the ability to use a card that was already used. It's a nice surprise card, but probably too inconsistent to be really super competitive. Especially because it costs that action. Action economy is very important. Next we have Strategic Shift, which is a one-cost spy card that you can include one of in your deck. For a special action, a player of your choice shuffles his or her command cards into their deck. Then that player draws 2 cards. Now, Strategic Shift is very strong. We live in a meta where you want to draw command cards as much as you can. Most lists run at least one leader in planning. Smugglers have black market prices, R2D2. There are Jabba the Hutt. There are a number of ways to draw command cards. In the Imperial faction, they have Roll by Fear. A lot of lists run that as well. People want to get to their good stuff. And so when your opponent already has 7 or 8 cards in their hand by the beginning of round 2, hitting them with Strategic Shift can entirely throw off their game plan. It throw off their entire game plan. So Strategic Shift's upside is very strong. Now, there may be some cases where you Strategic Shift your opponent and you actually end up giving them a couple of really good cards that they wanted. That can happen. It's a risk that you're taking. Another interesting interaction with Strategic Shift is if you have Intelligence Leak and Strategic Shift, do you play Intelligence Leak first, or do you play Strategic Shift and then look at their hand? I would think that most of the time you may you may want a Strategic Shift and then Intel Leak. Just having one card and knowing what that is very strong. However, there could be situations I see, like for example, say your opponents played Devotion and they got out Blaze of Glory from the deck, and they put that in there. You may want to Intel Leak Blaze of Glory and then Strategic Shift them. That way you know that you've gotten rid of it and they're not going to draw it. So it's very situational, like which you would do first if you had both in your hand. Strategic Shift, the reason you don't see it in every deck with spies, every list, is because, and this is true for a few of the spy cards, they're not as good late game, typically. At that point, most of the time, your opponent's played all their good cards, and it just doesn't have as much value. There's not as many command cards left in their deck. They may already be down to 2 or 3 command cards. You really want to get this card by the beginning of round 2. That's when you're going to get the most value out of it. And so the inconsistency of the value there is what keeps Strategic Shift from being in every spy list. It's still a very strong option, though. And nowadays, figures rely so much on command cards that I definitely think it's worth giving it a shot. So that's Strategic Shift. Next, we're moving on to Behind Enemy Lines. It's a 1-cost card you can have one of in your deck. It came in the Leia Organa expansion pack. And it says, use during your activation while in your opponent's deployment zone to look at the top 3 cards of their command deck and return those cards in any order. Now, this is really kind of just a fun card. On most maps nowadays, you don't run your figures across to the other deployment zone. There could be a case for saying maybe if you played Lion Ambush on a spy group, like for example the ISP Infiltrators, Lion Ambush lets you put your figures in either deployment zone at after 3 groups have activated in round 2. That could be actually a fun combo. You could put your ISP Infiltrators in your opponent's deployment zone and then play Behind Enemy Lines and look at their deck and return them in order. The problem there is, like, most spy groups are pretty fragile. That's kind of one of the weaknesses of the spy trait. And so it's going to be harder to pull that off. Having knowledge of what's coming next is pretty cool. You could do some fun interactions with that with Thrawn, like rearrange the cards and then go with Thrawn after that and have Thrawn discard that top card. So there's some cool things you could do with that, but again, it's a consistency thing. You don't know what 3 cards are going to be on the top of your opponent, so you don't know that you're typically not going to know if you're going to be able to get to their deployment zone. It's a lot of work just to rearrange 3 cards, and yeah, that's usually not worth it. So until there's more consistent figures where, like, I think a card like Lion Ambush could work with this, it's not really a competitive card. It's more of a fun card. Next is Stall for Time. This is a leader or a spy. Used at the start of a round, your opponent places 1 random command card from his hand on top of his deck. It's 0 cost, and you can have one of them in your command deck. And it came from the Lando Calrissian pack. Stall for Time is very interesting. It's not a card you see a lot of because it's random, so you don't get to choose it. You have no idea if you just put one of their best cards on the top, or you may have put a card that they didn't care about that they weren't going to get to use till next round anyway, like take initiative or something like that. I could see there being even some rare cases where putting a card on top may afford your opponent the opportunity to take strain that they may have not been able to take otherwise, as a card instead of as damage, like or help them because they know this is a card I wouldn't mind burning to prevent one of my figures from taking a damage. That being said, though, the upside is very high. Like being able to put a Blaze of Glory on the top of an opponent's deck and they have no way to draw it that round means that you've bought yourself critical time. But that's the thing about it, is you don't know what's gone on your opponent's deck unless you have Thrawn or you have Behind Enemy Lines where you can figure out what that card is. So the upside is high, but it's hard to know the value you're getting from it until after the game when your opponent may tell you, oh, this is the card that you put on top with Stall for Time. I don't know. I think it's definitely a card worth trying. It's a card that messes with your opponent's strategy. If you are able to hit the right card at the right time, like if you hit an On the Lamb with this, That is crazy awesome. It does combine well with Intel Leak 2. Um, Now, at the end of the round, your opponent's going to draw at least one command card. So you're not going to know all the cards in their hand. But you can know most of them. And so you have a good chance of being able to know, well, I know one of these cards is probably gone. Maybe it could have been the one they just drew, but, or, sometimes they would draw up to 3 command cards at the end of a round. Solve for Time. It's an interesting card. I would love to hear your thoughts below if anyone's tried it. I would say it's definitely has the potential to be competitive. I think it's just often overshadowed by other zero-cost cards that you're going to get value from. Next we have Cut Lines, which is a zero-cost one of in your deck from the ISB Infiltrators pack. Used at the start of a status phase, players cannot draw command cards during this round. Very interesting. This is strong against R2 and Jabba the Hutt, and it stops planning and black market prices. So if you've drawn all the command cards you're going to draw, or you're not going to be able to draw command cards that round, you play this at the beginning of the round, and you stop your opponent from drawing cards that round. So it's a strong option to stop card draw. The problem is, if you draw this in the late game, what's the point? Your opponent's already drawn out their deck. So once again, like a number of spy cards, its value depends on when you draw it. And there are other zero-cost cards that are just more valuable. This can backfire against you too. Maybe there's command cards you really need, and playing Cut Lines is denying yourself the opportunity to get more command cards. So it's a pretty niche card. I've actually never seen it played. I don't think it's good enough to be competitive. I'm sure it can win you games, but it doesn't have the consistency. And the last card we have today is Fool Me Once. You can actually play this with any figure. If you take 2 strain, you can use this during your activation to return your opponent's command discard pile to the game box. Then, if you are a spy, draw a command card. It's a 0 cost. You can have one of in your deck, and it came with Ahsoka Tano. So this is a fairly new card. You'll notice that most of these spy cards came out before Jabba's Palace. That's how old these cards are. Spies have not gotten a lot of love from the command card side of it in quite a while. I think that's sad. I think they should have more cards. But here's one they did get. Fool Me Once is a counter to decks that like to discard cards and then redraw them. So a great example of that would be Shared Experience, which is especially strong in decks like Imperial lists that run Zillow Technique, where they can discard a card for a block and then redraw a card because of some special ability, like Shared Experience. When a figure dies, you can redraw it. There's another one that's a 0 cost that droids and I think heavy weapons can redraw if they have a surge. So cards like that, Fool Me Once stops those discard piles from being reused over and over. Ironically, it also stops another spy, Leia, who can surge for military efficiency to put a card in her command deck back into her deck. So it stops that recycling effect. At this point in the game, though, recycling is not it's not a meta thing. Like, most lists are not going to play cards that are recyclable like that. They're more niche lists that do it and can do it effectively, but it's not something you're going to see in every list. So Fool Me Once doesn't really guarantee you that value. You can take the strain if you just want to draw another card. So I could see that, I guess, in spy figures that can take damage and recover it. It's basically half of a planning, like you draw one card, but it also has a negative effect. However, it doesn't cost you an action. So, I could see some lists with a couple of spies running it, at least to help you with command card draw. I haven't really seen it played much. That being said, there aren't many spies in the meta right now either. So that concludes our discussion on the command cards for spies. Forgive me, guys, if I was a little all over the place. This is my first video trying to get a grasp of how I want to do these videos talking about these cards. So hopefully this gives us a good start. I'll just go ahead and say real quick that there are definitely spies that are competitive in Imperial Assault right now. The Claudite Shapeshifter is a good figure. It's a solid, I think a lot of people would probably put it high tier 2 type figure. I think the regular gives you more value more consistently than the elite does. I've been trying both and I found that to be the case. Other spy figures that could find a place. Leia just doesn't really have the health right now. At a 1-to-1 health ratio, she's really poorly costed for her health value. Even though her abilities and her speed are excellent. If she had more health, she could become a viable figure. Verena, she's just below the curve. She doesn't do enough damage. Rebel Saboteurs, they do have a place. There's not very many of them now, but their stun and their double pierce right now has become more valuable than it was because of lists like Spectre Cell, because of what it can do to like Imperial lists with that double piercing to get through Zillow. So Rebel Saboteurs do have a place. The problem for them is you don't really want to be using your actions or taking any damage on them because they're already low health and they need to be running around and shooting stuff. So let's look at some of the other spies. Daba Thal. Yeah, he's okay. He's kind of like one of these fringe figures that can occasionally pop up in a list and do really well, but you hardly see him out there ever. He's definitely below the power curve. He really needs another attack die, and he could actually be pretty decent. Saska doesn't have enough health. Her ability is really strong to bring in figures from the mercenary faction. She doesn't do enough damage. She doesn't have enough health. But she is a nice figure to sit back because of the smuggler trait. There's a number of cards she could play, spy and smuggler cards, and just kind of sit back and camp on a terminal. So she's not really a tier 1 figure by any means, but I've seen her work in a couple of lists. Like she won a regionals last year too, so that's nothing to snuff at. That being said, I wouldn't play her. Jared, once again, another spy. You'll notice the theme here, right? Like spies have consistently in this game been undercost, or overcosted, I guess you could say. Like their health to cost ratio is lower than most of other figures. Jared is not a figure you want to take damage on. So a lot of spy cards aren't good for him. He's a brawler and he's melee, so he wants to be up in the grill. So he doesn't really have the action economy to spend doing a number of these special action cards. A lot of these cards have. Loku is just below the power curve. He's bad health to cost ratio. His attack doesn't do a lot of damage. His ability is way too hard to set up. So, Mern, she has that really cool hidden thing, which is nice. She's got decent surges. That +2 is really important. She also is a leader, so she can play cards like planning and stuff. The problem is just with low-cost rebels, you're often going to want to run Gideon and Hera. Hera just gives you so much more value for the same cost as Mern that it's hard to justify Mern in the current meta. Her command card is pretty cool though, and if 3 cost figures became like a big thing, I mean, False Orders is pretty strong. It would be fun to like move a R2 or a chopper off of a terminal and mess with your opponent in that kind of way. You do have to get within 3 spaces though, so Mern has to be somewhat in close to danger. Those are the rebels. We already talked about the Claudite. Imperials are interesting because they have the spy training card. I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but let's see here. I can't find it. Let's see if we find it here. Cross training. There it is. Cross training lets troopers gain the spy trait, and then they can replace a black die with a white die in their defense pool. So this is really interesting on figures like the regular riots are really strong candidates for this. You can have one riot sit back and just camp on a terminal, and they have the actions to play all those good spy cards. They also have the health to take the damage from something like Intelligence Leak. Whereas something like a Jet Trooper only has 3 health, so they're not as good of an option, even though they're cheaper. And the Riots also can sit on objectives, and with 5 health and 1 shield, they're not easily one-shot. So Riot Troopers are probably, the regular ones are probably the best unit right now to put the spy trait on in the Imperial faction. I've seen some people try other interesting things, like giving Sentry Droids a white die can be kind of annoying, but the problem with that is Sentry Droids don't really want to, and like a number of these figures, they just don't want to take the damage because they're already fragile, and they don't have the actions to play those cards. So I think the low-cost stuff like, maybe you could do one on a regular Death Trooper, maybe. Stuff like that, where that figure can sit back from harm and play cards and mess with your opponent in that kind of way is probably the best way to go. So that's enough of me rambling. So that's just talking about the spy trait. I'll try to get a little more concise and make it flow better for the next video. But thanks again, guys, for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.